you honestly believe you shouldn't have to tip if the service isn't absolutely perfect? It's a debate that happens at dinner tables every day, but for one arrogant customer, this belief wasn't just a casual opinion, it was a weapon. He walked into a busy diner, looked at a waitress who was clearly exhausted and doing her absolute best to support her family, and decided he was going to teach her a cruel lesson. When the bill came, he didn't just leave $0. He left a nasty personal note on the receipt that shattered her heart into a million pieces. He walked out feeling like a king, thinking he had won. But he made a massive miscalculation. He didn't know who else was watching. Just as the waitress collapsed in tears, the ground started to shake. A deafening roar of engines surrounded the restaurant. Suddenly, 140 hardened bikers, clad in leather and tattoos, marched through the front door. They weren't looking for a menu, they were looking for justice. What happened next wasn't just a tip. It was a life-changing event that forced a rude man to swallow his pride and proved that sometimes the scariest-looking angels ride Harleys. You need to see exactly how they settled the score. Is a tip a reward for excellence, or is it the tax we pay for human decency? This is the question that divides dinner tables, ruins dates, and creates a silent war between the people who serve our food and the people who eat it. We live in a world where the social contract is fraying, where the simple act of leaving a few dollars on a table has become a battleground for power dynamics, entitlement, and economic survival. For most of us, tipping is a reflex, acknowledgement of the fact that the person refilling our coffee is likely standing on feet that feel like they are burning, trying to make rent in an economy that doesn't care if they sleep or eat. But for a select few, the gratuity line on a receipt is a gavel, a tool used to judge, punish, and belittle. This story begins right there, in the uncomfortable friction between those who have everything and those who are fighting for just a little bit of something. To understand the gravity of what happened on that fateful Tuesday afternoon, you first have to understand the world of Jessica. Jessica wasn't just a waitress. She was a master of logistics, a therapist, a cleaner, and a diplomat, all for the federal minimum wage plus tips. At 26 years old, she carried the weight of a life that had thrown her more curveballs than she could catch. She was a single mother to a 4-year-old boy named Leo, a child with a smile that could light up a room and a medical condition that could drain a bank account faster than water through a sieve. Every morning, Jessica's alarm would scream at 4:30 a.m., dragging her out of a sleep that was never long enough. The darkness of the early morning wasn't peaceful for her. It was a countdown. She had to navigate the delicate choreography of getting ready in the dark so as not to wake Leo, counting out the medication he needed, and staring at the stack of envelopes on her kitchen counter, the white ones, the yellow ones, and the terrifying pink ones that signaled final notice. On the day that would change her life, the pressure was already suffocating. Her car, a rusted sedan that sounded like it was coughing up a lung every time she turned the key, had started making a new, ominous rattling noise. Her landlord had called twice the day before about a rent increase that she simply couldn't afford. As she tied her apron around her waist, the fabric worn thin from countless washes, she took a deep breath, put on her customer service smile, and stepped onto the floor of the Greasy Spoon. This diner was a local institution, the kind of place where the vinyl booths were patched with duct tape and the smell of bacon grease and stale coffee was permanently etched into the drywall. It wasn't fancy, but it was home to the regulars who came in for the early bird special, the truck drivers needing a caffeine injection, and the locals who just wanted a cheap meal. The morning rush was a blur of chaos. Plates clattered, the grill sizzled violently, and the bell above the door chimed incessantly. Jessica was the only server on the floor for the first 3 hours because her coworker had called out sick. She was moving like a whirlwind, pouring coffee with one hand while balancing plates of pancakes on her arm, her mind constantly running a mental calculator of her tips. $3 from table 4, $5 from the old couple in the corner. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But she kept moving, fueled by the adrenaline of survival and the terrifying love she had for her son. Every dollar was a diaper, a pill, a gallon of gas. Then, at 11:15 a.m., just as the lunch rush was beginning to swell like a tidal wave, he walked in. The atmosphere in the diner seemed to shift immediately. You know the type. Someone who enters a room and demands that the oxygen circulate around them first. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a suit that cost more than Jessica made in 6 months. His watch glinted under the fluorescent lights, a heavy golden anchor on his wrist. He didn't wait to be seated. He bypassed the "Please wait to be seated" sign with a scoff, scanning the room with a look of disdain, as if the very existence of the diner was an insult to his refined sensibilities. He chose a large booth near the window, a table meant for 4 people, and sat down alone, spreading his newspaper and his expensive leather briefcase across the entire surface. Jessica saw him and felt a knot form in her stomach. Waitresses have a sixth sense for customers. They can spot a generous soul or a nightmare from 50 paces away. This man radiated nightmare. He didn't look up when she approached the table. He kept his eyes glued to his phone, scrolling with an aggressive thumb. "Good morning, sir," Jessica said, her voice cheerful despite the exhaustion pulling at her eyelids. "Can I start you off with some coffee?" He didn't speak. He just tapped his empty mug with his index finger, a sharp tink, tink, tink sound that cut through the noise of the diner. It was a gesture you would use for a dog, not a human being. Jessica swallowed her pride. It tasted bitter, like old grounds, and poured the coffee. As she poured, she noticed him inspecting the silverware. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and ostentatiously wiped the fork and knife, holding them up to the light as if searching for microscopic germs. "I'll give you a minute to look at the menu," she offered. "I don't need a minute," he snapped, finally looking at her. His eyes were cold, assessing her value and finding it lacking. "I want the steak sandwich, medium rare, not medium, not rare, medium rare. If it's gray, I send it back, and I want the fries extra crispy. If they are soggy, I'm not paying for them. And bring me water with lemon, 3 slices of lemon, not 2. "Yes, sir," Jessica said, scribbling furiously on her pad. "Steak sandwich, medium rare, crispy fries, water with 3 lemons. Coming right up." The kitchen was in the weeds. Al, the cook, was sweating profusely, yelling about a broken fryer basket and a shortage of onions. When Jessica handed him the ticket, he groaned. "Medium rare on a sandwich steak? Who does this guy think he is, the Queen of England?" "Just do your best, Al, please," Jessica pleaded. "He looks like the type who will cause a scene." The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The man, whose name she later learned was Mr. Sterling, treated Jessica not as a server, but as a personal servant who was failing him. He snapped his fingers when his water level dropped by an inch. He complained that the music on the jukebox was too loud. He made a comment about her uniform looking a bit frumpy. Jessica took it all. She had to. She needed this job. She needed the tips. She imagined Leo's face, his laugh, and she used that image as a shield against Mr. Sterling's barbs. When the food arrived, the tension in the diner was palpable. Other customers were starting to notice. A sweet elderly couple at the next booth exchanged worried glances as Mr. Sterling loudly critiqued the color of his meat. He picked up a fry, squeezed it to test the crunch, and dropped it back onto the plate with a look of utter disgust. "I asked for crispy," he announced loudly, his voice booming across the diner. "This is limp. It's pathetic. Is it so hard to follow simple instructions? I suppose if you had the capacity for complex thought, you wouldn't be working here, would you?" The insult hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The diner went silent for a beat. Jessica felt the tears prickling behind her eyes, hot and stinging. It was one thing to complain about the food. It was another to attack her intelligence and her dignity. She was working 2 jobs. She was raising a child on her own. She was surviving in a world that was trying to crush her, and this man, with his soft hands and expensive suit, was mocking her struggle. "I'm so sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll have the kitchen make a fresh batch immediately." "Don't bother." He waved her away dismissively. "I've lost my appetite for the sides. Just bring me the check. And be quick about it. I have important places to be, unlike some people." This is the moment where the story shifts from a bad day to a tragedy. It's the moment where the power dynamic is supposed to be resolved by the transaction. But before we see what he wrote on that receipt, I want to ask you something. If you believe that hard work should be respected, and if you want to hear more stories about people getting the justice they deserve, please take a second to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share these stories with more people who need to see that sometimes The good guys do win. Jessica printed the check. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the bill folder. The total came to $24.50. She walked back to the table, placing it gently down. "Whenever you're ready, sir. No rush." Mr. Sterling pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. He didn't use a card. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill. For a split second, Jessica's heart leaped. Maybe he was one of those eccentric types who was rude but tipped well to make up for it. Maybe he realized he had been harsh. Maybe this was the miracle she needed to pay the electric bill. He handed her the 100. She went to the register, broke the bill, and returned with his change, $75, $50. He took the bills and the coins. He counted them slowly, right in front of her, making sure she hadn't stolen a dime. Then he picked up a pen. Jessica stepped back to give him privacy, watching from the corner of her eye as he scribbled on the merchant copy of the receipt. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and adjusted his cuffs. He looked at Jessica one last time, a smirk playing on his lips, a look of cruel satisfaction. "Service is a skill," he said as he walked past her. "Maybe you should find a new one." He pushed the door open, the bell chiming cheerfully, a stark contrast to the darkness he left behind. Jessica walked to the table. The diner was still busy, but the world seemed to tunnel vision down to that small piece of thermal paper resting on the Formica table. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and picked it up. She looked at the tip line. But it wasn't just the zero that hurt. It was what he had written in the blank space below it, in sharp, angular handwriting. The note read. The words hit her like a physical blow. The air left her lungs. It wasn't about the money anymore, though she desperately needed that $5 or $6. It was the cruelty. It was the invalidation of her entire existence. Get a real job. As if standing on her feet for 10 hours, carrying heavy trays, managing the emotions of strangers, and cleaning up their messes wasn't real. As if the sweat on her brow was fake. As if the pain in her back was imaginary. Jessica stared at the note, and the dam broke. She couldn't hold it in. A sob escaped her throat, a ragged, broken sound that made the other customers turn their heads. She collapsed into the booth where he had just sat, clutching the receipt to her chest. The unfairness of it all was too much. She thought about Leo, about the medicine she couldn't afford, about the rent that was due in 2 days. She felt small. She felt worthless. She felt invisible. The other customers looked on with pity, but no one moved. It's that bystander effect. Everyone feels bad, but no one knows what to do. The silence in the diner was heavy, filled only by the sound of Jessica's quiet weeping. It was a low point, a moment of absolute despair, where the universe seems to be screaming that you don't matter. But the universe works in mysterious ways. Sometimes, when you hit rock bottom, the impact sends a vibration out into the world. And sometimes, that vibration is answered. While Jessica was crying in the booth, staring at the cruel words of a man who thought he was untouchable, something was happening outside. At first, it was just a low hum, barely audible over the sound of the traffic on the main road. But then it grew. It deepened. It became a rumble that you could feel in your chest. The coffee in the mugs on the table started to ripple. The silverware on the empty tables began to jingle against the plates. The sound got louder and louder, a thunderous, mechanical roar that drowned out the jukebox. It sounded like an army was approaching. It sounded like a storm was making landfall. Jessica wiped her eyes and looked up, confused. The other customers turned toward the large front window. The cook, Al, came out of the kitchen wiping his hands on a rag, looking concerned. "Is that an earthquake?" he asked. It wasn't an earthquake. Through the front window, the parking lot began to fill. It wasn't cars, it was chrome. It was steel, it was leather. 1 by 1, then 10 by 10, motorcycles pulled into the lot. Massive Harleys, sleek Indians, custom choppers. They were loud, they were aggressive, and they were everywhere. They parked in rows, taking up every single space and then overflowing onto the grass, onto the sidewalk. The sun glinted off the chrome pipes and the black helmets. The engines cut off in a staggered sequence, leaving a sudden ringing silence in their wake. Then came the sound of boots hitting the pavement. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. The door to the diner opened. The bell chimed, but it sounded pathetic against the visual of what was entering. A man stepped in. He was huge, easily 6'5", with a beard that reached his chest and arms covered in tattoos that looked like battle scars. He wore a leather vest with a patch on the back that depicted a skull and crossbones, or maybe a wolf. It was hard to tell, but it screamed danger. He wasn't alone. Behind him, another man entered. Then a woman with purple hair and a leather jacket. Then another, and another. They poured into the diner like a black leather flood. The regulars in the diner shrank back into their booths, terrified. This looked like an invasion. This looked like trouble. Jessica, still clutching the receipt, stood up, her eyes wide with fear. She wiped her face frantically, trying to hide the fact that she had been crying. She was terrified. Was this a robbery? Was this a gang war? She looked at the first biker, the giant with the beard. He stopped in the middle of the room, taking up all the space, his presence dominating everything. He took off his sunglasses slowly, revealing eyes that were surprisingly sharp and observant. He scanned the room, ignoring the terrified looks of the other patrons. His gaze swept over the counter, the kitchen window, and finally landed on Jessica. He saw her red eyes. He saw the crumpled piece of paper in her hand. He saw the way she was trembling. He didn't smile. He didn't order food. He just looked at her, then turned his head slightly to the army of bikers filling the room behind him. "This the place?" one of the bikers behind him asked, a voice like gravel in a blender. The giant nodded once. "Yeah, this is the place." He turned back to Jessica and took a step forward. Jessica instinctively took a step back, her back hitting the wall. She was trapped. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't know that Mr. Sterling's cruel lesson was about to be overwritten by a lesson of a very different kind. She didn't know that the roar of those engines wasn't a threat. It was a cavalry. The giant reached into his pocket. The room held its breath. Was he reaching for a weapon? Was this it? But his hand came out empty, save for a phone. He looked at the screen, then back at Jessica. "You Jessica?" he asked, his voice deep and rumbling. Yes, she stammered. "I'm Jessica." "We heard you had a rough morning," he said. "We heard someone forgot their manners." Jessica was confused. How could they know? Mr. Sterling had only left 10 minutes ago. Who were these people? The biker cracked his neck, a loud pop that echoed in the silent diner. "We don't like it when people forget their manners, especially to working folks." He turned to the rest of the bikers. "All right, boys and girls, let's show 'em how we do it." What happened next was something that defied every stereotype, every expectation, and every rule of the diner. It wasn't violence. It wasn't chaos. It was something far more powerful. But to understand why 140 bikers decided to descend on a small, greasy spoon diner in the middle of nowhere, and to understand the connection between the rude businessman and this leather-clad army, we have to go back a few hours. We have to understand that in this world, eyes are everywhere. And sometimes, the person you think is a nobody is actually the most important person in the room. Mr. Sterling had made a mistake. He thought his wealth protected him. He thought his suit was armor. But he had forgotten the first rule of the street. Respect is earned, not bought. And he was about to learn that karma doesn't always come in a gentle wave. Sometimes it comes on 2 wheels, doing 90 miles an hour. The giant biker looked at the receipt in Jessica's hand. "That the note?" he asked, nodding at the paper. Jessica nodded, unable to speak. "Let me see it," he said gently. She handed it to him. He read it. His jaw tightened. The veins in his neck bulged slightly. He passed the note to the biker next to him. It was passed down the line from hand to hand. A ripple of angry murmurs went through the crowd of bikers. "Get a real job." "Incompetent." The words were fueling a fire that was already burning hot. "He thinks this isn't a real job," the giant said, turning back to Jessica. "He thinks you don't matter." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. It was attached to his belt by a thick metal chain. He opened it and pulled out a $20 bill. He placed it on the nearest table. "I'll take a coffee," he said. "Black, and keep the change." The biker behind him stepped up. He pulled out a 50. "Coffee." Keep the change. The next one, $100 bill. Ice water. Keep the change. Jessica stood there, frozen, as the realization of what was happening began to wash over her. They weren't there to eat. They weren't there to destroy the place. They were there to tip. But it wasn't just about the money. It was a statement. It was a wall of solidarity built by people society often looked down upon, standing up for someone society had just kicked while she was down. But this was just the beginning. The money piling up on the table was just the start of the retribution. Because while the bikers were settling the score financially, there was still the matter of Mr. Sterling. He was out there somewhere, thinking he had gotten away with it. He was probably laughing about it. The giant biker, whose name was Tiny, an ironic nickname for a man the size of a vending machine, leaned in close to Jessica. "Do you know where he went?" Tiny asked. Jessica shook her head. "No, he just drove off." Tiny smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "Don't worry, we know where he went. We passed him on the road. A guy in a suit driving a silver Mercedes like a maniac? Hard to miss." He turned to his crew. "Mount up, we're not done yet." The energy in the room shifted from benevolence back to that high-octane intensity. The bikers started to file out, their boots thundering against the floor. But before Tiny left, he looked at Jessica one last time. "Count the money, Jessica," he said, "and take the rest of the day off. We'll handle the customer service from here." As the engines roared back to life outside, shaking the windows of the diner once more, Jessica looked at the table next to her. It was covered in cash, bills of every denomination. It was a mountain of green. She reached out and touched it, tears streaming down her face again, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. But the story doesn't end with a pile of cash. That would be too simple. Because Mr. Sterling was about to find out that you can't outrun a storm when the storm is riding a Harley-Davidson. The bikers weren't just leaving a tip, they were delivering a message. And they were about to deliver it in person. Is revenge ever truly justified, or does it simply make us as bad as the aggressor? This is the uncomfortable question that sits at the heart of justice. We are taught to turn the other cheek, to be the bigger person, and to let karma handle the rest. But what happens when karma takes too long? What happens when the universe seems to be sleeping on the job, letting the cruel and the arrogant walk away unscathed while the innocent suffer in silence? Sometimes, waiting for cosmic justice isn't an option. Sometimes you have to become the karma you wish to see in the world. And on that Tuesday afternoon, on a stretch of highway baking under the relentless sun, karma wasn't an abstract concept. It was a convoy of 140 motorcycles moving in perfect, terrifying synchronization, hunting down a man who thought he was untouchable. Back inside the diner, the atmosphere had shifted from one of impending violence to a stunned, sacred silence. The roar of the engines had faded into the distance, leaving a ringing in the ears of everyone present, a phantom vibration that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Jessica stood frozen at the table, her hands hovering over the chaotic pile of cash that now covered the formica surface where Mr. Sterling's cruel note had been just moments before. It was a surreal tableau. The crumpled napkin with the insult was still there, but it was now buried under a mountain of green, crisp hundreds, worn 20s, crumpled 5s, and even a few heavy silver coins. It looked less like a tip and more like the loot from a bank heist, dumped unceremoniously onto a table that usually only held ketchup bottles and sticky syrup dispensers. Al, the cook, pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, his apron stained with grease, a spatula still clutched in his hand like a scepter. He stared at the pile, his eyes widening until they looked like dinner plates. The elderly couple in the corner booth, who had been too terrified to move during the biker invasion, slowly stood up and shuffled over, drawn by the magnetic pull of the scene. "Jessica," Al whispered, his voice cracking. Is that real?" Jessica couldn't speak. She reached out and touched a $20 bill, half expecting it to dissolve into smoke, a cruel prank played by her exhausted mind. But the paper was real. It was textured, fibrous, and smelled of leather, gasoline, and old wallets. She picked up a stack, then another. Her hands were shaking so violently that bills fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves. She fell to her knees to pick them up, and as she did, The reality of the situation crashed into her with the force of a physical blow. She began to count, not because she was greedy, but because she needed to ground herself in facts. She needed numbers to make sense of the madness. 100, 200, 500. The total kept climbing. The bikers hadn't just left a good tip. They had emptied their pockets. They had reached deep into their jeans and vests and given everything they had on hand. 1,000, 2,000. By the time she finished stacking the bills, organizing them into neat little piles that looked incongruous against the diner's cheap decor, the total was staggering. $4,250. It was more money than Jessica had seen in one place in her entire life. It was 3 months of rent. It was the repair for her car. It was the specialized medication Leo needed for the next 6 months. It was breathing room. It was a lifeline thrown into a drowning sea. Tears streamed down her face, hot and fast, dripping onto the cash. These weren't the tears of humiliation that Mr. Sterling had wrung from her. These were tears of release, the kind that come when a weight you've been carrying for years is suddenly lifted by invisible hands. They paid for everyone, the elderly woman said softly, pointing to her own table. That big man, the one with the beard. He put $100 on our table too, he said. Lunch is on the club today. The entire diner had been comped. The bikers hadn't just tipped Jessica, they had bought the entire restaurant's silence, or perhaps its gratitude. But while Jessica was experiencing a miracle, the man who had caused her pain was driving away, completely unaware that he had just kicked a hornet's nest that spanned 3 counties. Mr. Sterling was in his element. He was behind the wheel of his silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class, a vehicle engineered to isolate its driver from the plebeian world outside. The windows were double-paned acoustic glass, the suspension was air-cushioned to erase every bump in the road, and the climate control was set to a precise 68 degrees. He was miles away from the smell of the diner, miles away from the face of the waitress he had crushed. In his mind, the interaction was already deleted, a meaningless file in the hard drive of his day. He adjusted his rearview mirror not to check traffic, but to admire the knot of his silk tie. He picked up his phone, dialing his office. "Yeah, it's me," he barked into the speakerphone as the call connected. "I'm on my way back. And listen, get rid of Johnson. I don't care if his wife is sick. The numbers were down last quarter. If he can't focus, he can leave. We're running a business, not a charity." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He felt powerful. He felt in control. He accelerated, the German engineering responding instantly, pushing him back into the plush leather seat. He was the king of the road. The cars around him, battered sedans, dirty pickup trucks, were just obstacles to be weaved around. He checked his watch. He was making good time. But then he noticed something in his side mirror. At first it was just a speck, a dark cluster on the horizon behind him. Then it grew. It wasn't a single vehicle. It looked like a swarm of insects, moving fast, closing the distance with impossible speed. He frowned, tapping the steering wheel impatiently. He hated bikers. He hated the noise, the reckless weaving, the way they thought the laws of the road didn't apply to them. "Hold on," he said to his assistant on the phone. "I've got a bunch of organ donors coming up behind me. Let me just speed up and lose them." He pressed the accelerator harder. The Mercedes surged forward, climbing to 80, then 90 miles per hour. He smirked. There was no way a bunch of rattling motorcycles could keep up with a twin-turbo V8. He was wrong. The swarm didn't fade. It got closer and louder. Even through the soundproofed glass, he could hear it now. A low-frequency drone that vibrated in his teeth. It was the sound of Tiny's crew, the Iron Horsemen, and they weren't riding for leisure. They were riding in formation, a disciplined phalanx of steel and fury. At the front was Tiny, his face set in a grim mask of determination, his eyes locked on the silver bumper of the Mercedes. This wasn't just about the waitress, and here is where the story takes a turn that Mr. Sterling could never have predicted. You see, the universe is a web of connections, and sometimes you cut a thread that is attached to something much heavier than you realize. Earlier that morning, miles before Mr. Sterling had arrived at the diner, there had been an incident on the highway. The Iron Horsemen were not just out for a joyride, they were on a memorial run. One of their brothers, a young rider named Patch, had passed away from cancer the week before. They were escorting his ashes to his hometown for burial. It was a solemn procession. They were riding slowly, 2 by 2, headlights on, a rolling funeral cortege demanding respect and space. Mr. Sterling, late for his lunch meeting, had come up behind them. He didn't see a funeral, he saw a traffic jam. He saw a nuisance. He had honked his horn relentlessly. He had flashed his high beams. And when they didn't move fast enough for his liking, he had aggressively swerved into the breakdown lane, kicking up gravel and dust, and cut right through the middle of the formation, forcing 2 bikers to swerve dangerously to avoid a collision. He had flipped them off as he sped past, shouting obscenities out the window at a group of men mourning their dead friend. The bikers had been stunned. To break a funeral procession is a cardinal sin in biker culture. It is the ultimate disrespect. But they couldn't pursue him then. They were guarding the ashes. They had to stay with Patch. They had memorized the car, though. Silver Mercedes. License plate, success. A vanity plate that was about to become his downfall. When they pulled into the diner to regroup and cool off, they saw the silver Mercedes in the parking lot. They knew it was him. Tiny had gone inside to confront the driver, to teach him a lesson about respect. But when he walked in, he saw something else. He saw the same man, the same arrogance, abusing a young woman who was clearly struggling. He saw the note. It was a pattern. This man wasn't just a bad driver. He was a predator. He was a bully who got off on punching down. He kicked bikers when they were grieving, and he kicked waitresses when they were working. And that was unforgivable. Back on the highway, the trap was springing shut. Mr. Sterling looked to his left and gasped. A motorcycle was right there, inches from his door. The rider, a woman with purple hair whipping in the wind, stared at him through her visor. She didn't wave. She just pointed forward. He looked to his right. Another biker. This one was huge, riding a custom chopper with handlebars that reached toward the sky. He was matching Sterling's speed perfectly, boxing him in. "What the hell is this?" Sterling shouted, dropping his phone. "Get away from me!" He slammed on the brakes, hoping to force them to fly past him. But the bikers were pros. They anticipated the move. The riders behind him slowed in unison, a wall of braking lights flaring red. He was trapped in a moving cage of metal. The terror began to set in. This wasn't a coincidence. They were targeting him. His mind raced. Was this a carjacking? A kidnapping? He reached for his glove compartment, his hands trembling. He had a can of pepper spray in there, a pathetic defense against an army, but it was all he had. The bikers began to slow down, forcing the Mercedes to slow with them. They were guiding him. They were hurting him. Sterling tried to steer left, to break out of the formation, but 3 more bikes swarmed the gap, their engines revving aggressively, the sound like gunshots in the open air. He swerved right, and 3 more filled that space. He was completely under their control. They guided him off the highway, down an exit ramp that led to a quiet industrial service road. It was a dead end, a cul-de-sac surrounded by abandoned warehouses and overgrown weeds. It was the kind of place where no one could hear you scream. Sterling's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stopped the car as the road ended. He locked the doors. He checked the windows. He was hyperventilating. Okay, he muttered to himself, sweat beading on his forehead. Stay in the car. Do not open the door. Call the police. He fumbled for his phone, which had fallen to the floor mat. His fingers were slippery with sweat. He grabbed it, swiping frantically at the screen. No signal. He stared at the bars in the corner of the screen. 1 bar. 0 bars. 1 bar. It was flickering. Useless. Outside, the engines cut off one by one. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. The dust settled around the silver car. 140 bikers dismounted. The sound of kickstands hitting the asphalt was a synchronized clack, clack, clack that sounded like rifles being cocked. They formed a circle around the car. A sea of leather, denim, and unblinking eyes. They didn't yell. They didn't attack the car. They just stood there, watching him, waiting. Tiny stepped forward from the crowd. He walked slowly toward the driver's side door. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a judge. He stopped 3 feet from the window and crossed his huge arms over his chest. He didn't bang on the glass. He just motioned with one finger. Roll it down. Sterling shook his head frantically. "No, I'm not opening it. Get away from me," he screamed, though the sound was muffled by the glass. Tiny sighed. He reached into his vest pocket. Sterling flinched, expecting a gun. Instead, Tiny pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately. He pressed it against the glass. It was the receipt, the merchant copy from the diner. Sterling's eyes widened. He recognized the paper. He recognized his own handwriting. "Get a real job." How? How did they have that? Tiny pulled the paper back and leaned in close to the glass. He spoke clearly, his voice booming enough to be heard through the seal. "You like to leave notes," Tiny said. "You like to have the last word. Well, we have a few words for you too." Sterling was paralyzed. The connection clicked in his brain. The diner, the waitress, these bikers knew her? Was she their sister? Their daughter? Or was this something else? Then, Tiny did something unexpected. He stepped back and gestured to the crowd. Another biker stepped forward. It was an older man, gray-bearded, holding a small, ornate urn. He walked up to the front of the car and placed the urn gently on the hood of the Mercedes. Sterling stared at the urn. He didn't understand. Tiny spoke again. "You were in a rush this morning, Mr. Sterling. You were in such a rush that you cut through a funeral. You endangered the lives of 20 men. You disrespected our brother, Patch, on his final ride. And then you went to a diner and tried to destroy a woman who was just trying to feed her kid." Tiny's face hardened. "You think you're above the world. You think because you have this car and that suit, that people are just obstacles for you. Today, you're going to learn that you aren't the king. You're just a man. And right now, you're a very lonely man." The revelation hit Sterling like a bucket of ice water. This wasn't just about a bad tip. It was a reckoning for his entire personality. He had offended the living and the dead in the span of 3 hours. And now, the bill had come due. If you are enjoying this story and want to see more examples of instant karma and justice served cold, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us bring these narratives to life for you. Inside the car, the air was getting thin. Sterling looked at the urn on his hood, then at the receipt in Tiny's hand. He realized that his money couldn't help him here. His connections couldn't help him. He was facing a tribunal of the streets. "Open the door," Tiny commanded. "We're not going to hurt you. If we wanted to hurt you, you'd already be in the hospital. We want to talk, and you are going to listen." Sterling hesitated. His hand hovered over the door handle. He looked at the circle of bikers. They weren't holding weapons. They were holding their helmets. They looked solemn, stern, trembling, defeated, and realizing he had no other choice, Mr. Sterling unlocked the door. The click echoed in the silence. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the dusty air, his legs shaking so bad he almost collapsed. I didn't know," Sterling stammered, his voice a whisper. "I didn't know it was a funeral." "You didn't care," Tiny corrected him. "That's the problem. You didn't care." Tiny stepped closer, towering over the businessman. "But we're going to make you care. You see this receipt? You saved $20 by not tipping. You felt smart. You felt superior." Tiny pointed to the bikers. "We raised $4,000 for that waitress in 10 minutes. Because that's what real people do. We take care of each other. You take from people." I can pay," Sterling blurted out, reaching for his wallet. "I can give you money. How much do you want? 5,000? 10,000? The crowd laughed. It was a low, dark sound. "We don't want your money," Tiny said, disgust dripping from his voice. "We already paid your debt to the waitress. But you still owe a debt to Patch. And you owe a debt to your own soul." Tiny leaned in, his face inches from Sterling's. "You're going to get back in that car. You're going to follow us, and we're going to take you somewhere. And if you try to run, if you try to call the cops, well, let's just say we have your license plate number, we have your name, and we know where you work. Do we have an understanding?" Sterling nodded, pale as a ghost. Where are we going? Tiny smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We're going back to the diner. You forgot something. Sterling was confused. I forgot something? Yeah, Tiny said. You forgot your apology, and after that, you're going to join the procession. You're going to ride at the back, behind the hearse, all the way to the cemetery. You're going to pay your respects to the man you disrespected. You're going to learn what humility feels like, mile by slow, painful mile. Sterling looked at his Mercedes, then at the bikers. He realized his day of high-powered meetings and firing people was over. He was now a hostage of his own bad behavior. Get in, Tiny ordered. As Sterling climbed back into his leather seat, he felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life. The engine started, but the roar of the V8 gave him no comfort now. He was just a sheep in a wolf's den. The bikers mounted up, the engines roaring to life around him. They turned their bikes around, forming a convoy. But this time, Sterling wasn't the leader. He was the prisoner. They escorted him back toward the highway, back toward the diner. But as they drove, something strange began to happen. Sterling, forced to drive at the speed limit, forced to watch the road through the lens of the bikers surrounding him, started to see things he had ignored before. He saw the way they communicated with hand signals. He saw the way they blocked traffic to keep each other safe. He saw a brotherhood he had never experienced in his corporate boardroom, and he began to dread the moment he would have to walk back into that diner. He had left as a king, tossing insults like confetti. He was about to return as a pauper in spirit, forced to look Jessica in the eye. But what Mr. Sterling didn't know was that the diner wasn't empty. Word had spread. The town was small. People had seen the bikes. People had heard about the tip. When they arrived back at the Greasy Spoon, it wouldn't just be Jessica waiting for him. The parking lot was full. The local news van had just pulled up. Mr. Sterling wasn't just going to apologize to a waitress. He was about to apologize to the whole world, and the lesson was just beginning. Is public humiliation a form of justice, or is it just another kind of cruelty? When a person strips another of their dignity in private, does the universe demand that they lose their own dignity in the public square? We often say we want accountability, but what we really crave is the spectacle of the fall. We want to see the mighty brought low, the arrogant forced to eat humble pie in front of an audience. Mr. Sterling had spent his life believing that his wealth was a shield against consequences, a golden ticket that allowed him to bypass the basic rules of human decency. But as his silver Mercedes, now flanked by a roaring escort of 140 motorcycles, turned off the highway and headed back toward the diner, he was about to discover that the shield had shattered. He wasn't just returning to the scene of a crime. He was driving into an arena where the court of public opinion was already in session, and the verdict was not going to be in his favor. The journey back to the Greasy Spoon was a surreal slow-motion nightmare for Sterling. He was trapped in a mobile prison of his own making. The speedometer of his high-performance car hovered painfully at 55 miles per hour, dictated by the disciplined formation of the Iron Horseman. Every time he glanced in his rearview mirror, he saw the grim, bearded face of a biker, a constant reminder that escape was impossible. Every time he looked forward, he saw Tiny's massive back, a wall of leather and resolve that blocked out the horizon. The vibration of the engines seemed to seep into the chassis of his car, rattling his bones, shaking the confidence that had defined him for decades. He was a man who controlled boardrooms with a raised eyebrow, who could fire 100 people with a signature, yet here he was, reduced to a passenger in his own life, guided by men he would have crossed the street to avoid just yesterday. Inside the car, the silence was deafening. He had turned off the radio. He had ignored 3 calls from his office. His hands were slick with sweat on the leather steering wheel. He tried to rehearse what he would say. "I'm sorry, I was having a bad day." No, that sounded weak. "I didn't mean to be rude." A lie. He meant every word. "Here's $1,000. They had already rejected his money. He realized with a sinking feeling that he didn't have the currency to buy his way out of this. The currency here was humility, and his account was overdrawn. As the convoy approached the exit for the diner, Sterling noticed something strange. The traffic on the overpass had slowed to a crawl. People were standing by the guardrails, pointing phones down at the highway. He saw a news helicopter circling overhead, its rotors chopping the air with a rhythmic thwup, thwup, thwup. His stomach dropped. The spectacle had grown beyond the bikers. The story had leaked. When they turned onto the main road leading to the diner, the full scale of the situation hit him. The parking lot wasn't just full, it was overflowing. Cars were parked on the grass, on the shoulder of the road, in the ditch. People were spilling out of the diner's front door. There were locals in work boots, mothers with strollers, teenagers with smartphones, and right in the center, a news van with its satellite dish extended like a mechanical flower reaching for the sun. The bikers peeled off, forming a corridor that led straight to the front door of the diner. Tiny stopped his bike right in front of the entrance, kicked down the stand, and dismounted with a heavy grace. He turned and pointed to a spot right next to his bike. Sterling swallowed hard. He maneuvered his car through the gauntlet of staring faces and parked where he was told. He killed the engine. For a long moment he just sat there, staring at the familiar greasy spoon sign, the neon letters flickering slightly in the daylight. It looked different now. It didn't look like a dump. It looked like a fortress. Tiny walked over to the driver's side door and opened it. He didn't say a word. He just stood back and waited. Sterling stepped out. The flash of a camera blinded him for a second. A murmur went through the crowd. That's him. The guy in the suit. Look at his car. He felt naked, exposed. He smoothed his suit jacket, a nervous tic that offered no comfort. Walk, Tiny said, his voice low but commanding. Sterling walked. The crowd parted for him, not out of respect, but out of a morbid curiosity. They wanted to see the man who had kicked a hornet's nest. He kept his eyes on the ground, unable to meet the gazes of the people around him. He felt their judgment like a physical weight. He reached the door of the diner. Tiny opened it for him, the bell chiming that cheerful, innocent sound again. Sterling stepped inside. The diner was packed. Every booth was full. People were standing along the walls. But in the center of the room there was a clear space, and in that space stood Jessica. She looked different than she had an hour ago. She was still wearing her uniform, still tired, but there was a new strength in her posture. Her eyes were red from crying, but her chin was up. Beside her stood Al, the cook, holding a ladle like a weapon. And behind her, filling the booths, were more bikers, the ones who had stayed behind to guard the fort. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the sizzle of the grill, the beating of Sterling's own heart. Tiny walked up to stand beside Jessica. He put a large, reassuring hand on her shoulder, then turned to face Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," Tiny announced to the room, his voice booming without shouting. "We brought you back because we think you left something unfinished." Sterling looked at Jessica. He saw the pain in her eyes, but also the confusion. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked for a mob. She just wanted to do her job. Sterling started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat. "I want to apologize." "To who?" Tiny asked sharply. To you," Sterling said, looking at Jessica. "To Jessica." "And?" Tiny prompted. "And to everyone here," Sterling added, sweeping his hand vaguely around the room. I was out of line." "Out of line?" Tiny repeated, stepping closer. "You weren't out of line, Mr. Sterling. You were cruel. You looked at a woman working hard to support her family, and you decided to make her feel small so you could feel big. You wrote a note that was meant to hurt. You used your education and your status as a weapon." Tiny reached into his pocket and pulled out the receipt again. He held it up for the room to see. "Get a real job," Tiny read aloud. The crowd murmured angrily. That's what he wrote. "Tell me, Mr. Sterling, what is a real job? Is it sitting in an air-conditioned office moving numbers around? Or is it standing on your feet for 10 hours a day, serving people with a smile, cleaning up their messes, and doing it all so your kid can have a future?" Sterling looked down at his expensive Italian shoes. He had no answer. The logic of the street was piercing his corporate armor. "Jessica here," Tiny continued, his voice softening as he looked at her. "She's a mother. She's a fighter. And today, she's $4,000 richer because a bunch of bikers, People you probably think don't have real jobs either. Decided to show you what class actually looks like. A cheer went up from the crowd. People clapped. Jessica blushed, looking down at her hands. But money doesn't fix disrespect, Tiny said, silencing the room with a raised hand. Money pays the bills. Respect heals the soul. So, Mr. Sterling, you're going to do something for us. You're going to work. Sterling's head snapped up. What? You heard me, Tiny said. You think this isn't a real job? Fine. Prove it. Put on an apron. The crowd gasped. Then laughter rippled through the room. Al, the cook, grinned and tossed a spare, stained apron onto the counter. You're joking, Sterling said, his face flushing red. I don't know how to. It's not hard, Tiny said, crossing his arms. Just takes a little effort, a little humility. You're going to take Jessica's shift for the next hour. You're going to pour coffee. You're going to bus tables. You're going to take orders, and every single tip you earn, if you earn any, goes to her. I can't do that, Sterling protested, looking around for an ally. He found none. The camera from the news crew was now inside the diner, the red light blinking. He was live. You can and you will, Tiny said. Or we can go back outside and have a different kind of conversation. The threat hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sterling looked at the apron. He looked at the camera. He looked at the bikers. He realized he had two choices: total social destruction or a humiliating hour of manual labor. He chose the latter. With trembling hands, Mr. Sterling took off his $3,000 suit jacket. He loosened his silk tie. He picked up the apron and tied it around his waist. It was too tight. It smelled of onions and old grease. He felt ridiculous. He felt like a clown. Al, Tiny called out. Show him where the coffee pot is. For the next hour, the diner witnessed a spectacle that would be talked about in that town for a generation. Mr. Sterling, the titan of industry, the man who moved millions with a phone call, was reduced to a clumsy, sweating waiter. He poured coffee, spilling it twice. He took orders, mixing up the specials. He carried heavy trays that made his arms shake. He was yelled at by Al for moving too slow. He was corrected by customers who enjoyed the role reversal a little too much. Hey, buddy, a trucker called out from booth 4. I asked for more cream 5 minutes ago. Chop, chop. Sterling gritted his teeth and fetched the cream. Here you go, sir, he muttered. Smile, the trucker said. Service with a smile, remember? Sterling forced a grimace that looked like he was in physical pain. Jessica watched from the counter, sitting on a stool, a cup of tea in her hands. At first, she felt vindicated. It was satisfying to see the man who had belittled her struggle to do the very thing he had mocked. But as the minutes ticked by, as she saw the sweat dripping down his face, as she saw the genuine confusion and panic in his eyes when the rush hit, her feelings began to shift. She saw that he wasn't just incompetent. He was overwhelmed. He was out of his element. He was drowning in the chaos of the service industry. It wasn't just carrying plates. It was multitasking. It was memory. It was emotional regulation. It was physical endurance. By the time the hour was up, Sterling was a wreck. His shirt was stained with ketchup. His hair was disheveled. He was panting. He leaned against the counter, wiping his forehead with a napkin, looking defeated. Tiny walked up to him. So, the biker said, is it a real job now? Sterling looked at Tiny, then at Jessica. He took a deep breath. Yes, he wheezed. It's harder than it looks. It is, Tiny agreed. And she does it every day, with a smile, for peanuts, while people like you treat her like dirt. Sterling nodded slowly. The arrogance was gone. It had been sweated out of him. I understand. He turned to Jessica. He walked over to her, not with the swagger he had earlier, but with a shuffle. He looked her in the eye. Jessica, he said, his voice quiet. I am sorry. Truly, I was a jerk. You work hard, harder than I realized, and you didn't deserve what I wrote. Jessica looked at him. She saw the change. It wasn't a complete transformation. Men like Sterling don't become saints in an hour. But it was a start. It was a crack in the facade. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, she said softly. Apology accepted. The room was quiet. The tension had broken. The spectacle was over. But Tiny wasn't done yet. There was still one more piece of the puzzle. The funeral. "All right," Tiny said, clapping his hands. "Show's over, folks. Let's get back to business. Mr. Sterling, you did good. You survived. But we still have a ride to finish." Sterling looked up, confused. "A ride?" "Patch," Tiny reminded him. "You still have to pay your respects to the man you cut off." Sterling paled. He had forgotten about the hearse. He had forgotten that his penance wasn't just labor. It was witnessing grief. "Get your jacket," Tiny said. "We're leaving." Sterling untied the apron. He put his jacket back on. He felt different in his suit now. It felt heavy. It felt like a costume. He followed Tiny out of the diner into the bright afternoon sun. The crowd followed. The bikers mounted up. The engines roared to life, a thunderous salute to the end of the intermission. Sterling got back into his Mercedes. He waited. Tiny pulled up alongside him. "Follow the hearse," Tiny shouted over the engine noise. "Do not pass. Do not honk. Just drive. And think." The convoy moved out. This time, Sterling was at the back, right behind the black hearse, carrying the ashes of the fallen biker. The pace was slow, solemn, dignified. As they drove down the highway, Sterling watched the hearse. He saw the stickers on the back window. He saw the flowers. He saw the bikers riding in formation, their heads bowed slightly against the wind. He realized that this wasn't a gang. It was a family that protected its own, a family that had just extended its protection to a stranger named Jessica. He thought about his own life, his empty apartment, his ex-wife who wouldn't speak to him, his employees who feared him. He had money, yes. But did he have this? Did he have 140 people who would ride into a storm for him? The question gnawed at him. And as the cemetery gates came into view, looming large and wrought iron against the sky, Mr. Sterling felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was envy. But the story doesn't end at the grave, because while Sterling was learning his lesson, something else was happening back at the diner. The news report had gone live. The internet had seen the video of the businessman in the apron, and the world was reacting. If you want to see how the internet reacted to this incredible story, and if you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, even guys like Mr. Sterling, make sure you're subscribed, because the finale of this story is going to blow your mind. Back at the cemetery, the bikes parked in rows. The silence returned, heavier this time, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The bikers dismounted and formed a circle around the gravesite. Sterling stood at the back, unsure if he should approach. Tiny waved him over. "Come here," he said. Sterling walked through the crowd of leather and denim. He felt small, but he also felt included, in a strange, twisted way. They lowered the urn. A few words were spoken. Tears were shed. Rugged men hugged each other. It was raw and real. When it was over, Tiny turned to Sterling. "You saw respect today," Tiny said. "You saw loyalty. You saw hard work. Take that back to your office. Take that back to your life. Don't let this just be a bad day you try to forget. Let it be the day you woke up." Sterling nodded. "I will," he whispered. "I promise." Tiny extended his hand. It was a massive hand, calloused and scarred. Sterling looked at it, then reached out and shook it. It was a firm grip, a pact. "Go on," Tiny said. "Get out of here and drive safe." Sterling walked back to his car. He got in. He started the engine. He didn't speed away. He drove slowly, respectfully, until he was out of the cemetery. As he merged onto the highway, heading back toward the city, he felt exhausted, but he also felt lighter. He looked at his passenger seat. The receipt was still there. He picked it up. He looked at the words, "Get a real job." He took a pen from his pocket. He crossed out the words, and underneath he wrote, "She has the hardest job in the world." He crumpled the paper and tossed it into the back seat. He didn't need the reminder anymore. He had the memory. But while Mr. Sterling was driving into the sunset, a changed man, the story had one final twist waiting for Jessica. The money the bikers had left was life-changing, yes, but the video of the incident had gone viral. Millions of views in hours. A GoFundMe page had been set up by a stranger who saw the news. When Jessica checked her phone that evening, after the bikers had left and the diner had quieted down, she saw a notification. She opened the app. She stared at the screen. She blinked. She refreshed the page. The number hadn't changed. In fact, it was going up. The bikers had given her $4,000. The internet had given her something else entirely. What Jessica saw on her screen wasn't just money. It was freedom. It was a future for Leo. It was a house. It was a new car. It was the end of the struggle. But amidst the celebration, there was one final message. A private message sent to the diner's Facebook page. It was from a user named R. Sterling CEO, and what that message said would bring Jessica to her knees one last time. Not in pain, but in absolute, overwhelming gratitude. Because sometimes the villain of the story doesn't just learn a lesson, he tries to rewrite the ending. And Mr. Sterling was about to make the biggest tip of his life. Can a villain truly become the hero of his own story? Or are some people simply broken beyond repair? We love to believe in the concept of redemption, in the idea that a person can stare into the abyss of their own flaws and come back changed. But in the real world, egos are often harder to break than concrete. We are cynical. We assume that a public apology is just damage control, that a moment of humility is just a performance to save a stock price. But what happens when the cameras stop rolling? What happens when the crowd disperses, the adrenaline fades, and a man is left alone with the echo of his own cruelty? That is the true test of character. And for Mr. Sterling, the man who had tried to crush a waitress with a pen stroke, the real journey didn't end when he drove away from the cemetery. It began in the silence of his empty, expensive home, where he had to decide if he was going to double down on his arrogance or tear his life down to the studs and rebuild it. The sun had long since set over the small town, casting long purple shadows across the parking lot of the Greasy Spoon. The roar of the engines was a distant memory, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the hum of the neon sign that buzzed like a dying insect. Inside, the diner was quiet. The frenzy of the afternoon, the bikers, the news crews, the gawking locals, had evaporated, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavy with significance. Jessica sat in the back booth, the very same booth where Mr. Sterling had sat hours before. But the table wasn't covered in a white tablecloth and fine silverware. It was covered in receipts, cash, and a smartphone that wouldn't stop vibrating. The digital world had caught fire. The video of the CEO waiter, as the internet had dubbed him, was everywhere. It was on TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and the evening news. But unlike most viral moments that breed toxicity and division, this one had sparked something different. It had sparked a movement. People weren't just laughing at Sterling. They were talking about service. They were sharing their own stories of being mistreated in retail and hospitality. And, most importantly, they were finding the GoFundMe page that a kind stranger had set up for the waitress who stood tall. Jessica looked at the screen, her eyes blurring with exhaustion. The number on the campaign was staggering. It had started with a goal of $5,000, enough to cover her immediate debts. It was now sitting at $42,000 and climbing by the minute. Strangers from countries she had never visited were sending $5, $10, $20. Comments poured in like a warm rain. For Leo. Buy yourself a vacation. Respect from London. Keep your head up, Jessica. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. For years, Jessica had operated in survival mode, where every penny was pinched until it screamed. She had built a fortress around her heart to keep out the disappointment of a world that seemed indifferent to her struggle. Now that fortress was being dismantled, brick by brick, by the sheer force of collective human kindness. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and incredibly, achingly grateful. But then, the notification popped up. It wasn't a donation. It wasn't a comment. It was a direct message to the diner's business page, which she managed on her phone. The username was simple, stark, and familiar. R. Sterling, CEO. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Part of her wanted to delete it unread. Hadn't he done enough? Hadn't he apologized? What more could he possibly want? Was he going to threaten to sue her for the video? Was he going to demand his dignity back? She looked at Al, who was mopping the floor near the counter. "Al," she whispered. "He messaged me." Al stopped mopping. He leaned on the handle, his face serious. "The suit?" "Yeah." "Well," Al said, wiping his brow with a rag, "only one way to find out what he wants. But remember, you got 140 uncles on speed dial now. He can't hurt you." That thought gave her strength. She wasn't alone anymore. She tapped the notification. The message opened. It wasn't a short, angry rant. It was a wall of text, a letter. Jessica read the message twice, then a third time. She sat there, frozen, as the words rearranged her entire reality. A trust fund, medical bills, college, rent. The phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the table. She put her hands over her face and sobbed. But these weren't the tears of despair that Mr. Sterling had caused that morning. These were the tears of a mother who had just been told that her child was safe. The crushing weight that had sat on her chest since the day Leo was born, the fear of the future, the fear of not being enough, the fear of the financial cliff, had vanished. Al rushed over, concerned. "Jess? What did he say? Did he threaten you?" Jessica couldn't speak. She just shook her head and pushed the phone toward him. Al picked it up, squinting at the small screen. He read the letter. His eyes went wide. He whistled, a low, long sound of disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned," Al whispered. The Grinch grew a heart. He looked at Jessica, a massive grin breaking across his face. "Kid, do you know what this means? You're free. You can breathe." Jessica looked up, wiping her eyes. "I can breathe," she repeated, testing the words. They tasted like honey. But the story of Mr. Sterling's redemption didn't stop with a private message. True change ripples outward, affecting everything it touches. The next morning, at the headquarters of Sterling Industries, the atmosphere was tense. The employees had seen the video. They expected a rampage. They expected layoffs. They expected a CEO who was angry at the world for embarrassing him. When Richard Sterling walked in, the office went silent. He wasn't wearing his usual three-piece armor. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt, no tie. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He walked to the center of the open-plan office. He didn't go to his glass tower. He stopped by the receptionist's desk, a woman named Sarah, whom he had walked past every day for 5 years without ever learning her name. "Good morning, Sarah," he said. Sarah looked terrified. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling." "How are your kids?" he asked. Sarah blinked. They're good, sir. Tommy just started soccer." "That's wonderful," Sterling said, and he meant it. "Listen, everyone." He raised his voice so the floor could hear him. "There are going to be some changes around here. Starting today, we are implementing a new policy. No more working weekends unless it's an absolute emergency. And we are doing a salary review for all support staff. If we can't afford to pay you a living wage, then I don't deserve to be the CEO." The room was stunned. This was the man who counted paper clips. This was the man who fired people for typos. "And one more thing," Sterling said, pulling something out of his pocket. It was the crumpled, stained receipt from the diner. He walked over to the wall where the company's mission statement was framed in gold. He took the frame down. He taped the receipt to the wall in its place. "This is our new mission statement," he said. "It's a reminder. She has the hardest job in the world. It reminds us that every person we deal with, every client, every janitor, every waiter, is fighting a battle we know nothing about. Treat them accordingly." He walked into his office and closed the door. He sat at his desk and looked at the empty chair opposite him. He felt lighter than he had in decades. He had lost a little bit of his pride, yes, but he had gained his soul. Meanwhile, back in the small town, the legend of the Iron Horsemen grew. They weren't just a motorcycle club anymore. They were local heroes. Tiny became a minor celebrity. People would buy him drinks when he walked into bars, which he would politely decline, asking them to donate the money to the local children's hospital instead. But the bond between the bikers and Jessica remained strong. They didn't just drop off the money and leave. They checked in. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, a group of 5 or 6 bikes would pull into the diner parking lot. It wasn't always the whole gang. That would be bad for business. But it was a rotating guard. Tiny came the most. He would sit at the counter, order a coffee and a slice of pie, and ask about Leo. One afternoon, a few months later, Jessica brought Leo to the diner. It was his 5th birthday. He was a small boy, with big, curious eyes and a shy smile. When he saw Tiny sitting at the counter, he hid behind Jessica's leg. "It's okay," Jessica whispered. "That's Uncle Tiny. He's the one who helped us." Tiny spun around on his stool. He looked at the boy. The giant biker, who looked like he could wrestle a bear, melted. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small leather patch. It was a miniature version of the club's logo, but instead of a skull, it had a smiley face. "Happy birthday, little man," Tiny rumbled. "This makes you an honorary member, but you gotta promise me one thing." Leo stepped forward, taking the patch. "What?" "You gotta listen to your mom," Tiny said seriously. "She's the toughest person I know, tougher than any biker." Leo nodded solemnly. "I promise." Jessica watched them, her heart swelling. She thought about where she was just a few months ago, crying over a $0 tip, feeling worthless. And now she was standing here, surrounded by a makeshift family of misfits and outlaws who had shown her more love than she had ever known. But there was one final loose end to tie up, one final meeting that needed to happen to close the circle. A year later, on the anniversary of the incident, Jessica took a drive. She wasn't driving the rusted sedan anymore. She was driving a reliable, safe SUV. She drove out of town, past the diner, onto the highway where Mr. Sterling had once cut off a funeral procession. She drove until she reached the cemetery gates. She parked the car and walked through the rows of headstones until she found the one she was looking for. It was a simple stone, black marble, etched with a motorcycle, and the name Patch. There were fresh flowers on the grave, and standing there, with his head bowed, was a man in a suit. Jessica stopped. She recognized the silhouette. It was Richard Sterling. He looked older, his hair grayer, but he looked peaceful. He heard her footsteps and turned around. When he saw her, a flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by a warm, genuine smile. "Jessica," he said, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I wanted to pay my respects," she said, walking up to stand beside him. After all, if it wasn't for him, none of this would have happened. Sterling looked down at the grave. "You're right. It's strange how the world works. One man's tragedy became another man's salvation." "How are you, Richard?" she asked. She didn't call him Mr. Sterling anymore. "I'm better," he said. "I'm working less. I'm volunteering more. My ex-wife actually agreed to have coffee with me last week. It's a start." "And the company?" "We're doing well," he said. "Profits are down slightly, but morale is up. I can live with that trade." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind rustling the trees. It was a comfortable silence. The animosity was gone, replaced by a shared understanding of how fragile life can be. "I never got to thank you in person," Jessica said. "For the trust fund. Leo started kindergarten this year. He loves it. Knowing that his future is safe, you have no idea what that means to me." Sterling waved his hand dismissively. "Don't thank me. It was the least I could do. I owed a debt. I'm just glad I could pay it." He looked at her, his eyes serious. "You know, I kept that receipt. It's on my wall. I look at it every day. It reminds me that the most powerful thing you can do is admit when you're wrong. And the most powerful thing you can do," Jessica added, "is forgive." She reached out and took his hand. It was a gesture of absolute absolution. The waitress and the CEO, the victim and the villain, standing over the grave of a biker, united by a strange, chaotic, beautiful series of events that had changed them both forever. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, they walked back to their cars together. They were from different worlds, and they would likely never cross paths again in this way, but they were connected by an invisible thread of grace. The story of the waitress and the biker gang became a local legend, a bedtime story parents told their children to teach them about kindness. But the real lesson wasn't about the bikers, or the money, or the viral video. The real lesson was about the choice we make every single day when we walk out our front doors. We can choose to be like the old Mr. Sterling, closed off, entitled, believing that the world exists to serve us. We can choose to leave a nasty note, to cut someone off in traffic, to look down on the people who serve our coffee. It's easy to be cruel. It requires no effort. Or we can choose to be like Tiny, to see injustice and step in, to use our strength to protect the weak, to rally our community when someone is hurting. And we can choose to be like Jessica, to keep standing when the world tries to knock us down, to work hard, to love deeply, and to forgive even when it feels impossible, because you never know who is watching. You never know whose life you might change with a single $20 bill or a single kind word. You never know when a simple act of disrespect will summon a storm, and you never know when a simple act of mercy will start a revolution. The universe is always listening. And sometimes, just sometimes, it answers with the roar of 140 engines, reminding us that no matter how dark the night gets, the cavalry is always just around the corner. We live in a world that is desperate for these kinds of stories, stories that remind us that good people still exist, and that redemption is possible for anyone brave enough to seek it. If you believe in the power of second chances, and if you want to fill your feed with more stories that touch the heart and challenge the spirit, please do yourself a favor. Click that subscribe button right now. Leave a like if you think Jessica deserved every penny, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that kindness always wins in the end. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your heart open.